Kia ora koutou katoa, no Ruth Brown ahau, e tipu aki o ki rotorua, e noho ana o ki pōneki. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohi nei. Ka mihi hoki o ki ngā tohu o te rohi nei. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. So I've got to tell you something about this talk. When I first thought about this talk in August me thought it would be great to talk about politics in November. We'd have just had elections in New Zealand and the US. It would feel relevant. But I don't know about you, but November me is kind of over talking about politics. So instead, I'm going to talk about sheep farming in the Wairarapa of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Lots of grass. And more specifically, these two sheep farmers, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Katie and Sally, and my gorgeous niece and nephew, Isabel and Sam. So last year, something interesting started to happen. They started feeling really bad about farming and their place in New Zealand. There was environmental legislation going through that was going to impact their business, and it felt unfair. But worse than that, they felt like New Zealanders had turned their backs on them. After a few conversations about how they felt and what was going on for them, I was naturally like, okay, well, let's look at the data. And I found and pulled a recent survey on New Zealanders' perceptions of sheep and beef farmers in New Zealand. And I was like, nah, guys, you're sweet. See, 5 times more people feel positively about sheep and beef farmers than negative. But to my surprise, it didn't help. And when I asked them what made them feel that people thought that, they really struggled to articulate it. They were sure it was true because they heard that it was true all the time, but they just weren't sure who actually felt like that. And I started getting frustrated at them. I started thinking about reasons why they were wrong, not exactly my best sister-in-law self. Then I realised that what I was observing was something that I'd been thinking about lots mainly since 2016, if I'm honest. Group polarisation. Sally and Katie were meeting with groups who all felt the same. They were on Facebook groups where everyone felt the same. They were in their own echo chamber. What was happening was what at the time we were seeing all over the world. It wasn't their fault, it was just a quirk of human nature combined with technology. And I looked forward to sharing my insight with them next time we caught up. But worse was to come. After that epiphany, a slow realisation came over me, and it was in the form of this, which we've already talked about today. Blind spot bias. It's truly the worst of the bias collector set. The tendency to identify biases in others more than in oneself. So rude. For while it was easy for me to identify Sally and Katie's echo chamber, I wasn't at all taking into account my own echo chambers, where, in one of my particular echo chambers, we debate things like whether being vegan is an essential part of intersectional feminism. I had so normalised my own worldview that I was getting annoyed with the people I love for theirs. So I started reading things that they shared on Facebook. My best move was following New Zealand's most popular farming Facebook page. And while I had to scroll past the odd sexist joke or political meme, I also got exposed to a whole world I'd have never seen otherwise. I learned how much farmers struggle with their mental health, how much they care about their animals' welfare, and how closely tied their family and their work were to each other. I even learned the best type of 4 to 5 metre drill for a 200 horsepower tractor. Spoiler alert, it really depends on the type of soil and terrain, but I'd say an Allen custom drill would be a safe bet. So for someone whose job it is to be curious, I'd been a pretty slow learner. So I started doing this in other aspects of my life. I'd follow paths out of my own echo chamber and into other people's. It took a bit of work, as often I'd have to make my way through a forest of trolls, but then I'd end up in some similar person's feed who happened to have polar opposite views to me. And the trick here was for me not even to think about whether I agreed or disagreed with their views. It was to experience the information that was coming at them through their eyes, and to ask myself, if I was in their situation, getting this information, how might it shape how I thought and felt? So let's unpick what happened for both Sally and Katie and I in that situation. I want to explore the why behind group polarisation. What is it about humans, our psychology, and particularly our group psychology that's got us here? I'm going to talk about 3 really well-evidenced reasons for group polarisation that layer upon each other. So think of it like a really unappetizing group polarisation layer cake. Okay, the first layer is easy. It's a foundational one. It's homophily, which quite simply comes from homos, meaning same, and phily, meaning loving. So it's same loving. So basically, people generally tend towards hang out with people who are more similar to them. We can see this all around us. An example familiar to most of us is that our likelihood to hire people more similar to us than different. But this isn't new. We've known this back as far as 16th century with the saying, birds of a feather flock together. Although for accuracy's sake, the actual quote is, birds of one kind and colour flock and fly always together. So that's layer 1. Then we add the next layer, social comparison. In a nutshell, social comparison theory shows that after discussions, groups will shift their perception more in the general direction that the group was heading. It's like we're all trying to outdo each other with how much we fit in. I can recall times that I've been totally guilty of this, and it's proven out in all sorts of other situations. People watching sport are more likely to get angry at the ref when they're in a crowd with their team's fans. Mock juries are more likely to give higher monetary judgments for serious crimes once they've deliberated together. And moderately pro-feminist women become more strongly pro-feminist after discussions as a group. I'm sure that one's not true. For the final layer of our group polarisation cake, we have the persuasive arguments effect. What this theory says is that, 1, people are convinced by novel arguments, and that people will lean towards the side that is giving them the most number of arguments. So I hope you're getting a sense of how bad this cake is for us. We like to hang out with people like us, then once we're in an identified group, we're constantly trying to prove to each other why we fit in, often going more to the extremes. And lastly, we're sharing evidence on the same side of that argument, and the more evidence for one side, the more we believe it. A 1986 meta-study highlighted these theories as the main causes for group polarisation. Now, I want you to pay particular note to that year, 1986. I was 8 in 1986, and I imagine that many of you weren't even born. In fact, this guy was only just born. Any guesses on who this is? It'll seem obvious once I tell you. Faith? Yeah, you're right, Mark Zuckerberg. You'd win the teams like Guess the Baby competitions. Mark Zuckerberg was 2 when this study came out. So while it's easy to think that social media has caused these problems, these are human and group psychology problems. Social media has exacerbated them, absolutely. They made forming groups easy. They made muting and unfollowing people we disagreed with easy. They made sharing content without a lot of thought easy. Their algorithms show us more of who and what we're already engaged with, and these algorithms are black boxes. However, with all that said, I'm not going to spend that much more time on social media companies specifically, as, well, I don't work at one, and I imagine you don't either. But a lot of us, including myself, work in product companies. I'm particularly interested in 2 common traits of product companies that may have played their part in some of that polarisation that we see today. Firstly, speed of delivery. We're probably all familiar with Facebook's mantra, move fast and break things. In fact, this has become a way we did things in product for about the last decade, albeit under some other names like minimum viable product, build, measure, learn, lean UX. Now, I'm not saying that any of these things are bad, or maybe I'm saying that move fast and break things is bad. But the rest, quite the opposite. These methods and philosophies serve an important purpose. They meant that product got into the hands of our users more quickly, and we could learn from that. Continuous learning was essential. But I think over the last decade, we've also learned that some things are too important to just throw out into the wild and learn from. In the daily podcast, in an episode aptly named Jack Dorsey on Twitter's Mistake, has anyone listened to this? It's a good listen if you haven't already. The CEO of Twitter was talking to an interviewer about a product idea they had to reduce the spread of misinformation. The interviewer, falling into the trap that we've already all previously fallen into, was like, well, that sounds like an excellent idea. Why don't you just release it? And Jack's response was an interesting one. He said, you're pointing to some of the biggest issues in the dawn of our company. Why not just launch something instead of think deeply about it and see what the ramifications are? There are certainly positives that we can imagine, but there are probably some negatives as well. I think there are times for experimenting in the wild, and I think there are times that we need to be more careful. We have our own examples of this at my own current company, Xero. Many of our users are power users, and I came from TradeMe, which was largely casual users, where we could experiment really easily. It took me a while to catch on that the philosophies that had served me well in my previous role had very different implications here. My teammate Victor is currently working to understand the anatomy of MVPs that have gone well in our organisation and ones that have not met ours or our customers' expectations. If we can understand that, we can work out how, as researchers, we can play on our part in making those more successful. On to the second one, measurement. I reckon measurement is the biggest nut that we haven't cracked in product. Too often we measure something that feels simple or something that's measurable, rather than working to measure the right thing, even if it's much harder to measure. According to Guillaume Chasleau, an ex-Google employee who worked on the YouTube recommendation algorithm, YouTube's goal was to maximise engagement, so basically maximising watch time at all costs. Now, they succeeded in this, and watch time and revenue both went through the roof. But to maximise watch time, they needed to recommend things that continue to pull people further and further into their platform, and maybe not surprisingly, into more extreme and polarising content. What started as a simple metric actually had real consequences in real people's lives. And YouTube's obviously not alone here. A 2016 internal Facebook presentation stated that 64% of all extremist group joins were due to Facebook recommendation tools, and this is ultimately, again, about trying to increase that engagement. But there are examples of companies who are trying to do measurement well. Is anyone from Stuff here? Cool. Oh no, I actually just... Our largest digital media company, Stuff, announced that this September that they were moving their internal success metric from clicks, a pretty well-established metric in media, to public trust. It's early days to see whether this was the right measurement for them, but I'm impressed that they decided to measure something harder but more important. I want to know if they're here so I could find out how it's actually going. A non-digital example is what we're trying to measure as a nation. Like most countries, Aotearoa New Zealand use GDP as our main measurement for success as a country. And like many measurements before it, even the designer of GPD, Simon Kuznets, knew it wasn't up for the task. The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred by a measurement of national income. 3 years ago, New Zealand decided to opt for a broader measurement of how our country was doing. Just as YouTube engagement couldn't measure the impacts on users' lives, GDP wasn't measuring our Kiwis' lived experiences. So the government has iterated on a wide-ranging framework for measurement, and it includes things as broad as workplace safety, research and development spend, child poverty, water quality, and te reo usage. And what I love about this is I believe it changed the conversation we were having during our last election. We were holding our leaders to account for things like child poverty and water quality, and there were consistent measures that we could actually measure them against. Will it be perfect? Absolutely not, but I think it's a great step forward. Now, I want to turn our attention to ourselves. So how do UX people, our community, become susceptible to polarised thinking? I want to look at two ways that I've commonly seen this show up. The first is that we become polarised between other people in our own organisations. I was with a group of UX researchers and designers recently, and there was a vocal majority who were expending a heap of effort complaining about other people in their organisation. Complaints were often focused towards the decision makers or product people they were working with. One of the most common complaints was that this group didn't care enough about their end users. I listened for a while getting increasingly fed up before I spoke. When I did, I questioned whether as UX people in an organisation, we actually had two user groups that we cared about. We had our end users that we test and write reports on, but weren't the very people we were complaining about our users too. They were the people who we often actually deliver to. And to get annoyed at them for not understanding their users when we weren't doing anything to understand them felt misguided at best and hypocritical at worst. Now, just pause here to to state something important. Calling a bunch of people hypocrites was an egg move on my part. Not only unkind, but more importantly, you can't be curious and defensive at the same time. So when I made someone feel like they had to defend their current position, I made it really hard for them to be curious about what a different position might look like. What I did do, though, was talk through a piece of research that Kathy Harper from our team has led, where she got every member of our team to interview a product manager or owner. Some people chose people they had great relationships with, some people chose people who the relationship had been hard. We asked a bunch of questions about what they saw as their and our role, what they would do to change about how we worked, and my favourite question, what do you wish we understood about your role and your pressures? What we got back was really enlightening. Delivering product was ultimately on their shoulders, but they didn't get anything done without others. They were at every other team's mercy. They had a huge desire to be user-centred and make user-centred decisions, but they needed our help. And lastly, they craved information, but often had to make decisions with incomplete information. When we analysed it as a group, had to show a Miro board, spend my life. When we analysed it as a group, we ended up with 34 how might we's for how we could change to help our product teams deliver well. Examples were how might we balance being embedded with being unbiased, or how might we contribute to a body of knowledge in a product space over time. So why was it important for us to change? Well, it depends on what your goal is, really. If our goal as researchers in our organisation is to write a great report, then job's tidy, we've delivered after that report is written. But if our view of success is getting great product or great experiences into the hands of our users, an amazing report doesn't mean anything. If those insights from our research don't end up changing the product and in turn changing people's lives, then I believe we've had zero impact. Now, on to the second way I see us becoming polarised within our community when it comes to methods and approaches. I'm really unsure whether I need a content warning on this section, but let's just wade on in. I see a long list of things that as a UX community, we either feel are silver bullets, or that we decide are terrible, or that we can't agree on, or that we spend time arguing about. We see Medium posts and articles and talks in the extremes, and we share them either because we really agree or because we disagree. And I believe that we fall into those same group polarisation pitfalls. Let's dig into one of those, Net Promoter Score or NPS. I've had to argue my way into the middle of both extremes of the NPS argument. NPS is the only measurement our organisation needs, right through to NPS will ruin our company. And so what does the middle actually look like? Well, firstly, it acknowledges that MPS does have pitfalls that we all know about. Here's just a list of some of them. But what this list fails to capture is the context of any organisation and where it's heading, and where we could harness MPS as a launchpad to become more user-centred. As my friend Perrin puts it, is MPS perfect? No. Is MPS the only human metric in the boardroom? Yes. So being able to have a conversation about our customers at the board level is essential. If MPS gives us the ability to do this, then awesome. At an organisation I've worked at, they made MPS a core component of the leaders' bonus packages. It wouldn't have been my recommendation, but whatevs, I didn't have control over that decision. However, about 6 months later, MPS started to go down, and I have never seen a bunch of people care more than ever about the customer experience. Action groups were set up, programs were put in place. So then we were actually able to use some of that momentum as a force for good. So next time, it just might be my recommendation. Now, to finish off, here are 3 things I reckon we lose as a community when we disagree on the extremes of UX topics. Firstly, we don't harness our collective knowledge. We each only have the tiniest of slithers of information on any given topic. We don't know other people's experiences in other companies. For us to be able to take our narrow experience of a method or approach and extrapolate that out to every situation and every company feels oversimplified. For a community who used to be famous for it depends, we've kind of got out of practice. On to number 2. When we live in the extremes, I believe we stop learning. Back to my favourite quote, you can't be curious and defensive at the same time. I believe that when we're defending something in the extreme of this is never or this is always the thing to do, it's hard to stay curious and stay open to new information or approaches. And lastly, I think we waste time and effort. And it's this energy and effort that I want to spend our limited time together talking about. Each of our time, brain space, and emotional energy is finite. If we're spending time at any of those extremes, I'll ask you one thing. Is that the very best way to spend your precious energy in your precious life? And if the answer is yes, ridding my company of MPS is my life's work, then again, fill your boots. But if the answer is no, or not always, then I'd like you to do an exercise with me. I want you to grab a page of your notebook, and I want you to write it up like this. Now, I want you to think about the way you spend your energy or your brain space or your time inside or outside of work. In the middle, write down things that you feel you've got about right in terms of how much time and energy you give them. On the left-hand side, write in things that you spend more time on, reversing. On the left-hand side, write in things that you spend more time and energy on than you'd like. And on the right, write the things that you under-invest in, often as a result of the things on the left. So this is a hard one to do, so I'm actually going to do it for myself so that you kind of get a sense of it, and then I'll give you a minute to do it yourself. So I feel like I spend the right amount of time with my family. I feel like that's pretty balanced at the moment. I know I spend too much time on US politics. I shouldn't know the names of US Supreme Court judges and not know the name of any New Zealand Supreme Court judges. That's an investment in time that doesn't serve me or the universe well. And I spend too much time reading the news. So then the other side is the hardest things to write. What am I not spending time on as a result of things on the left-hand side? For me, this is probably action on inequality. I read lots about it, I do lots of thinking about it, but how am I actually putting that energy into action? So you've probably got about a minute to have a go at that for yourself. Cool. You can probably keep going on that later if you want to. So now, your personal version isn't something to feel guilty about. Think about it as your own personal nudge to where you really want to be heading. It's not about changing all of these things tomorrow, but I've found it useful when I'm spending more time on that less of side to think, oh, that's right, I see what trap I'm falling into here. And why does it matter? Well, it matters because collectively in this audience, we have the ability and skills to influence and solve some of the world's gnarliest problems and our organisation's gnarliest problems. In that podcast interview that I was talking about before with Jack Torsey from Twitter, he also went on to say that what he's realised is they needed more social scientists and behavioural economists on their team. As a group of people, our skills have never been so in demand. And I think we can all agree that there are a heap of things worth solving in the world. So my ask of you today is two simple things. Firstly, stay curious. We need to keep improving and learning as individuals and as a community, and we don't do that if we don't stay open. And secondly, harness your precious energy in the best possible way for your particular life. It won't be how I would harness mine, and it won't be how the person sitting next to you would harness theirs. But make your own time, energy, and brain space count. After all, what we give our attention to is who we become. Thanks.